Okay. Somebody's taking
Why do you
feedback.
have all the reverberation? Ms. Barnes, Ms. Boyette is waving at you.
Thank you.
We got,
Is it me?
It's not me.
must be.
We're trying to fix that. Is it me?
Try it now.
All right, is that better?
Mhm.
It does appear that it's not. Something like that.
Thank you. Nope, it's still there.
Not me. Somebody joined the computer on me already.
It's coming from that.
Okay, is that better? Okay,
Neighbor's kid.
thank you very much. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Wilson County Board of Education to order. Members of the board, we ask for approval of the agenda. Is there a motion?
Madam Chair,
Mrs. Powell,
I move that we approve the agenda for the special meeting of the Wilson County Board of Education.
Second.
it has been moved by Mrs. Powell, seconded by Mr. Mercer, that we approve the agenda for the special board meeting of May 10th, 2021. Please record your vote, Mrs. Barnes. Mrs. Barnes? We're not hearing you. Are you muted on your end?
Well, she's lighting up like she's speaking.
Yeah, okay, she's put her thumb up. Please note that Mrs. Barnes has responded by putting her thumb up, that she is voting in favor of the motion. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mr. Borkin?
Aye.
Mr. Breen? Mr. Mercer? Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
And myself, Dr. Fitch, aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. For the members of the public, we are following the governor's executive order, and so the persons in the boardroom are all masked. The only board member not in attendance is Mrs. Barnes, who is participating in the meeting remotely. Now, if you would please, and we are being live streamed, you may use the system website in order to connect with our Facebook account, and you may find us on Greenlight and Spectrum, channels 22, I believe. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, to be followed by a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Members of the board, we are here today to work and have discussion in regard to our long-range facilities planning for our school system. We have taken a lot of time, as we have worked through our policy manual and the work before us in regard to our long-range facilities can be quite an undertaking. And as we move forth, we know that the administration is going to provide us with all of the necessary information that we will need to be able to make a decision at a future date. So we thank you for your attendance today. We thank you for your diligence. And we thank you for the hard work that will come in relationship to what it is we are about to undertake. So at this point, I will now turn it over to Dr. Mills for his comments and to begin this process.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Board members, I'm going to share my screen. Is that you with the, there you go. Perfect. Board members, we have looked through information. We started last time sharing a little bit about facilities and some of the information from the ORED report. As you remember, they did some forecasting for us and some analysis. And then what we've tried to do is go through, and I wanted to do a couple things today. Review that information very quickly again. Then we've got some information to share from our existing facilities and the trends for that, and some facts from Mr. Letchworth, Mr. Woodard, and Dr. Williams. And then we've got some discussion pieces that we need to look at in terms of next steps and what we would recommend in terms of how do we get to the next phase of this process. And there's plenty of time for questions throughout. Again, the first part you will have seen before, but I'm going to go through that kind of quickly. And we have looked at some of our existing facilities to point out some things there. So this is more of a foundational kind of approach to it, looking at our existing buildings, what we can and can't recommend doing there, just as a starting spot. And then I've provided you information from Mr. Letchworth for our capital plans for athletics only, as well as for all the buildings. And then I've done some things where some what-if scenarios are things that you could begin to think about. None of those are set in stone. These are just first glance from looking at our capacities and our numbers and some things you've talked about and have come up. So this is a chance for you to have conversations about where we are and some of the things that pop up. I will say, starting out, that we really need to move forward from this aspect of it to some action on plans for the capacity issues in our buildings and the facilities themselves. Some of that conversation was clear. Support from the county commissioners in our budget meeting the other night. But from a facility standpoint, there's a couple pathways that we could take, and I wanted to share with you some observations that I think are important. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. So just reviewing where we've been. We shared this last time. We've seen some reductions in enrollment. So that's a matter of school assignment or consolidation. We've looked at our buildings to address current issues. We're looking at funding in terms of how we manage our current facilities. I've got some information on that. Long-term planning, facility needs, and then the commissioners indicated they've supported discussing recommendations for long-term needs and improvements. What we know, again, review. We know the enrollment trends in the forecast. That's usually one of the things that causes us delays. Land usage issues, those are forthcoming. I've talked with the planning office here in the county, and so they'll be providing that information. I don't think we need that right now for today, but we will need it coming up. So I think that would just muddy the water right now, but that's going to be very important as you look at patterns from, not only from the forecast, but from patterns for our schools and our communities. So they've been very cooperative and very helpful. And so that information will be updated from what was, you remember that little tidbit from the ORED report that showed a few spots in the Rock Ridge, Jones, and New Hope section, but that will what we'll be looking at for the entire county to take that into consideration. We've got some pieces and parts about maintaining or upgrading our existing buildings and their capacity. Again, that's nothing new, but I want to point out some trends there. And then we've also talked about maximizing our existing funds by looking at our facilities. So when we finished last time, the next steps in process were setting priorities and where to invest, any particular school level, utilization, and those kinds of issues. So I wanted to walk through some of those today. And then the last step from last time was we need to talk about what information we needed, determine what input is needed, and when, and how does the board want to proceed. So what we try to do is get us to the point where there's enough information out there that we can go to that next step. And I think we've got enough there that you can clearly see some of the things we need to do. So that's just a quick review. If you remember, I've got some of this elsewhere in the presentation. The forecast from ORED, from K5, blue line, red line, high school, yellow line, middle school. We've seen the forecast over time. It's relatively flat. Again, membership forecast for elementary schools. We've got one school that is predicted, again, to be at a higher utilization by 29-30. I do know, and everyone else knows, that the pandemic has affected some of these things, but the pattern's going to stay the same. I mean, it may affect some of the base numbers, but your overall pattern's going to remain the same. And I'll point out some things about capacities as we go. In a second, I've got a summary slide. Middle school and high school, Elm City Middle, over time is going to get a little bit tighter. Springfield certainly is already at utilization that would make it relatively tight. And then Hunt is the one high school that we see utilization beyond what the capacity is ideal for. That doesn't mean the buildings can't handle that, it just means it's ideal. Okay, so it doesn't mean there's problems. Quickly, just again to review, utilization map, if you remember looking at that, we've got a few elementary schools that are in the upper areas. Middle school, again, just pointed that out from the data table. And then high school, you've got Hunt that's over utilization. Again, you've seen these data, but I just wanted to refresh everyone's memory. Got some elementary, some middle, current and 5-year utilization that are at or nearing capacity or will exceed what is ideal capacity. And these are the same from the table. So current trends, I tried to take some of the existing data from Power School. I just wanted to show these to you. There's nothing earth-shattering about this. There's nothing that doesn't add up with what we've seen. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this because I want you to have time to talk and go through some things. And that is, we've seen our overall ADM go down over the last period of time, flattening out. Somewhere around 10.4 now. That's total. If you look at elementary, that accounts for the majority of the downward trend. Middle school, we can see a little bit of an uptick, but it's relatively flat. It's hovering around 2,400 to 2,500, right through there. In high school, somewhat of a downward trend over the last little bit, but again, kind of hovering in that same range. So while we've seen some things from this past year, the trend's the same. Whether you back it out 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, the same kind of trend. So as we move ahead and as you start making decisions, certainly you're going to want more precise information for some things we'll need to do, and that can be obtained. And we can talk about when in the school year might want to lock on that. Typically, we look at second month data to lock in on as you're doing your predictions and forecasts. That's what ORED would use as well. So just keep that in mind. But again, overall pattern is very consistent with what we saw from ORED. I tried to just give you just a reference sheet looking at by school, by level, just to show you some of the changes. Just this last column is just between the last 2 years, current and the year before, as we went into the pandemic, so nothing shocking here. This is the same pattern being played out across the state in many cases. But you can see that elementary is accounting for a majority of that. I thought you might want this as a reference. Middle school, again, that's a little bit of a anomaly compared to some of the other ones with a little bit of an increase. And then high school, okay. So where we start getting into some of the conversation pieces from this point on is looking at your capacities in our buildings and the usage. And what I've tried to do is just take the information from the ORED report for now and what the forecast was out to the maximum, which was 2030. And the one thing that stands out is, regardless of level or year, we have plenty of capacity for our buildings. Okay? So we're not running out of space as an overall factor for our schools. There may be a school here or there that's exceeding or right at capacity, but the global numbers by level or for the district available space, if you will, that's not our issue. Our issue isn't we're running out of space. Our issue is we have more space than students, and we need to maximize that piece and redistribute that piece. At the same time we do that, we've got to look at our capital needs and make decisions about what that needs to look like. So if you're going to do this project, it's best to do it within the aspects of capital planning as well as adjusting for capacities at our schools. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, you've seen this before, but we've got majority of our schools were built before 1980s. We've got 17 schools that have part of the buildings or the buildings that are constructed prior to the 80s, and the majority of those are elementary schools. Now, you will recognize that some of these schools have been completely redone except for one section. I mean, I'm not going to go through and highlight all that, and you know that from some of the other sheets we've shared, but just as a pattern, if you were looking at this, what this tells you is that the majority of our buildings that need renovations are elementary. I mean, just look at the age of the buildings. The middle school buildings have been done more recently, and so those are not really going to be in the mix. There might be some things we need to address, but if there is a pattern that we would need to talk about, then it's going to be the elementary schools due to their age. Again, some of them have been updated extensively, some minor, but that's still the core of that building is older than some of our other facilities. Okay. Again, you've seen this. I just wanted to show you when the last several additions have been done. I gave you this as a reference last time. This might be a question you have, so I wanted you to have that as a reference. Thanks, Linda. All right, so where do we start? So that's all review from what you've seen from ORED and some other pieces. And some of what we talk about today can sound redundant, but I think it's really important for you to just look through some of these pieces and parts and really start having discussions about what priorities are or how you want to get to those priorities and where we are with existing buildings and needs. So again, it may sound redundant, but I think it's important to really lay out the foundation, two main concepts. And so for recommendations and first steps, here's what we've got. I think from looking at your capacities and looking at where we are, you're going to need to address school assignment. You have more capacity than we have students. It's distributed all across the county. We've got needs for buildings primarily at the elementary level, although there's needs at most all buildings. So school assignment is going to have to be something that needs to be addressed. And assignment is joined capital planning. These two projects do not need to be done in isolation. Okay, they're conjoined, if you think about it. I know everybody loves a Venn diagram, that's the prettiest one I can find. But if you're going to look at capacities, and you're going to need to do that, then at the same time, we need to be strategic about where we look at renovations and what we want to invest in so that those two things coincide. It's not going to be a separate entity to go in and do school assignments for attendance and not take into account things you're going to need in those buildings. That may be the same thing, which means it's not a bad problem to have to do those things at the same time. It makes sense. So I wouldn't want you to think that one you have to do first, another you have to do second. They're going to need to be kind of in a dance together, if you will, as we go through it. So here's some points that I think from us looking at our data and pieces of the reporting you've seen. So if you're looking at school assignment, it's not just one school level. I think you're going to need to revisit it at all three school levels. Although you've got primarily a lot of elementary schools that more of those than anyone else, you're still going to have to do that for all school levels. You've got capacity at all elementary, middle, and high school. You have some hot spots at a few schools. So it's not a matter of doing one level and then waiting and doing another level. It's a matter of all need to be done. Okay? The part that the board will need to spend some time on to provide feedback to whomever is doing the assignment work is what are your priorities. The computer will only do so much. You've got to tell it what you want it to focus on. And typically those have entailed distance to school, how much capacity you want to leave remaining if you assign students. And that's the part of the growth patterns we talked about from the county planning office to look at housing starts and developments in those areas. That's where that will take into account those pieces as you look at your assignment. And again, if you're determining school assignments, you got to look at your capital needs at the same time. So those are three priorities that you're going to talk about to be able to do the school assignment process, to be able to provide whatever consultant or process we use, guidance for that computer system or for whomever to make those assignment choices. There's no way around that. The other piece, again, I'm going to keep saying is you've got capacity available at all of our schools. So we're not in growth mode. We're not running out. There's some hot spots. So we've got the ability to do this. We're not having to have mobile units and things like that and do temporary pieces. Again, pandemic has affected enrollments, but it's not going to change your patterns over time. We've seen that already from the trends just from the last 2 years. And we have also got the new Watt building coming, so we've got some plans to go on for that too. Okay, so these are all good times to do this now. The second part is, again, assignment is joined to capital planning. If you're going to redistribute student assignments, then another conversation piece that needs to take place concurrently is whether you're looking at renovating existing buildings or seeking capital funds for new buildings, okay? The return on investment piece. So that could be a matter of consolidation, it could be a matter of renovation, but the prioritization of capital needs as we go through that we'll need to look through each of those buildings as we get through that priority process and get input and feedback from folks that know to help us make those decisions. But they're gonna have to be done conjointly. Okay? I also think from our discussions and conversations with the last little bit, we need to consider funding for athletic facilities as part of the capital plans for school needs. At the same time we're doing this, there's no reason we can't go and look at our overall athletic facilities and talk about what those need to be prioritized for, so that work can be done concurrently, and you don't have to wait for one step, so we can get caught up. And that was some conversations you heard the other night at the budget meeting. But that work could coincide with the planning for assignment and not interfere. Because if you think about it, we've talked a lot about elementary schools, middle and high schools could be mostly assignment and then some renovations, so the athletic piece of that wouldn't really be affecting some of the decision making you're looking at for elementary schools. Okay? Make sense so far? Okay. All right, so I took a look at the GIS just for review for everybody. I looked at elementary, middle, and high, and I did a global map and then a zoom in just in the city. And the thing that on all of our maps is that we're all contiguous. We have no satellites, and most of our boundaries are easily identifiable based on streets or features. So it's easy to explain. I'll point out a couple of things when we get a little bit further in. We do have some districts that are rather large because of the lack of density in population. That's not uncommon in school systems, and especially those east of 95. But I'll point out a couple of things later on in these maps, if you will, about some where our schools are located, some of our lines. And that'll be a part of the process the board needs to consider as well. Okay, so I want you to be able to see these again. These are just quick screenshots off the GIS system. Middle school, same thing. Larger out in the county, and again, following natural boundaries or existing hard boundaries, so you could explain them. Contiguous, no satellites. So it's very easy to tell folks where you attend based on an address versus having satellites in pieces and parts. And satellites typically are used for balancing school assignments when there's capacity issues and other things that we're not having to worry with. So it makes it a much better process for the board to work through. If you're looking to zoom in at the city for the middle school, again, same kind of process. These have been in place for quite some time. And finally, high school. No satellites again. And then the hard boundaries. And if you look inside the city limits, right inside of town, you can see they're following hard boundaries that are identifiable. Okay. So we look through, what we tried to do is just pull together some general issues for elementary, middle, and high schools, and then some general facts, some things we've seen from a maintenance standpoint, and then look at some what-if scenarios that just will be questions you'll be asked most likely by whomever does any of the next steps for you as the board starts having these discussions. So issues for elementary, you're going to have to address school assignments. That's part of it. Those need to be addressed. You could look at combining elementary schools and invest in renovations or new buildings. That's an option. You could also, based on the capacity we have in the age of some of our buildings, you also look at consolidating those schools and seeking funding for a new school in a central location. That is a possibility for some campuses, and that's a discussion that you're going to have. One issue that's at the elementary school that's not at the middle and high is the K-3 class size requirements. If the districts were to be set up so that there were less schools with more students in them, then that's going to give some flexibility to a district for class size requirements, because what we're running into and what many school systems run into are having to split those classrooms into combinations and add additional positions when you have very small schools and more of them, because that flexibility we have lost as a school system to be able to manage some of that over time. So that's something that the school systems across the state have had the same discussion. So just keep that in mind. Issues for middle school. Primarily the issue of school assignment. You've got a couple of schools, Darden and Spate, that are underutilized, and those are your newer schools. So from a management standpoint, it's more efficient for those schools in many ways. Springfield and Elm City are near capacity. Again, these schools are relatively younger than the elementary schools. So renovations would be a good investment for these schools versus a new school need. And athletic projects could begin there as well. Again, it's not going to interfere with some of the planning that you have to do. Okay, so you could run those concurrently again. You don't have to do step by step as we go through this for that component. If you look at high schools, Bettyfield's underutilized, and the Watt move is going to make that part of a plan for addressing that. We've had some conversations about that. Those will be ongoing. But even before Watt, that's an area where we need to look at capacities and utilization. Hunt is at capacity. So the primary issue, again, for high schools is school assignment. And renovations are certainly appropriate there, because you're not looking at adding a new high school somewhere because of our growth factors. We've got capacity, we've got the enrollment to handle that, or manage that rather, through the capacity we have. And again, athletic projects could begin for high schools. So I think again, this is going to sound redundant, but the elementary is where you're going to have some more challenges for decision making because of the need for either renovations or building. High schools and middle schools are going to be more renovations. They're going to be more stable to look at from a capital planning versus elementary, because you're not going to have as many to deal with, and more of them are newer. So general issues I think you need to keep in mind as we do this is that building costs are currently higher than normal. That could change, but that point was made the other night, and everyone understands that. That doesn't mean they're going to stay like that. Everyone's in the same boat. That doesn't mean you shouldn't begin your process for planning and renovations and building, but it is something to keep in mind. We're going to need time for approval and construction, whether it's renovations or building. That process needs to be planned for, so the sooner you start, the sooner you finish. You're also going to need time to plan for staff and families, to make them aware, make them be able to plan, and there'll be some pieces and parts as the board looks at that, depending on what steps and directions you take. And then some school renovations could require some changes at the school. We can manage many of those internally, and how we schedule them, how we do them. And we've talked with Mr. Letchworth, Mr. Woodard, and Dr. Williams and I talked. We've shared some things with the county manager about some existing projects. We're meeting later this week. So there's things you can move around within a building and schedule so that you're not disrupting a school building during operations and the timing of things to take place. Much like what we do roofs in the summer, so you're not, tearing up the ceilings and hearing all that noise when you're trying to have class, those kinds of things. But some of these renovations or decisions, it could take more planning if you're having to move things around and do some extensive work. So, next part. If you haven't gotten numb from all the slides so far, here's where we've gone back through and looked at the status of some of our buildings. And Mr. Letchworth is here, Mr. Woodard's on the call as well. But if you look at Barnes, we have property to rebuild and can utilize the newer section or keep and renovate. So it's built to extend out on those wings. Okay, and there's land there for that, if you think about it. So that's a good design process to work off of. Frederick Douglass, that roof was replaced in 2013 and repaired in 2017. We have property to add on or rebuild, but the concern with Frederick Douglass is you would need to take a close look at the renovations versus the rebuilding and see what's most appropriate. And Mr. Letchworth and his staff could answer questions about that, but that's going to be a matter of, there's a few aspects of that building that you could build off of, but a lot of it would be major renovations, and then the question is it better just to rebuild with the land that you had there to be able to expand out if you were doing that? Gardeners could be renovated. It's had roof work done. It's been repaved. The control system for the HVAC is scheduled to be in place this summer. Again, we're trying to do those as we go. The new chiller was installed in 2007. You've got a few pieces out there that we would have to look at, but for the most part, that is a school that you could renovate and manage that, and you also have space to do so out there without being landlocked. Hearn, that building could be renovated. The issue with Hearn is it's not going to be easy to expand there because you are landlocked. The roof was installed in 2021 on that 1980 section. We just finished that, and that's a good thing to have done. But Hearn could do a little bit there and certainly could renovate within, but it's not, the footprint can't get too large because of where it sits in the neighborhood and the streets around it. So those are things to keep in mind as we go to the next steps. Jones, that building was built to be able to be expanded if it was needed. Of course, it's got plenty of capacity, and right now it is your newest building. So no issues to work off of there. It's just decision points. Lee Woodard has property to expand and add on if needed. It's in a good location to do that. Building's got a new roof in 13 and 17 aspects of it. Just had a new chiller put in place, and the paving was done in 2019. So from a facility standpoint, it's not as landlocked as some of the other ones, and it's had a fair amount of work done to it to bring it up to speed already. Lucama is relatively newer construction on that, renovations. It could be renovated or parts of it replaced. There's really not much out there that's older, but they've got plenty of property to expand if needed. Okay. New Hope, you've got some property out back to renovate or expand. I do think we need to look at the traffic flow and drives for access there, how that stacks up, and that building could be renovated or expanded. It is one that's at capacity. Rock Ridge, that school could be renovated or parts of it replaced, but actually it's fairly new, but it has property to expand if needed. I mean, you've got the access to do that there to a degree, but that is one that's been done in the last little bit, with the exception of a part or two, so it's in good shape. Stantonspur could be renovated, but this school would take some serious consideration to look at renovations versus a rebuild. The limits there are deal with the land and the acreage for the footprint of it and where it's located. Vic School, that main building was re-roofed in 04. Auditorium was done in 19. The building could be renovated. The land issue could limit some expansions because of where it's sited, and that will be one to consider the cost to renovate versus rebuilding if you were to look at that because of the age of some of that facility and some aspects of the design. If you think about walking around that building and access points and how the wings are set up. Vincent Bynum, right in the middle of town, certainly has land for expansion or building there. That building could be renovated as well. Not one of your new ones, but it's had work done to it and is in a central location. Wells is a school where there's property to allow for rebuilding and keeping the newer section. Think about that media center on back is a new section. The rest of that building is pretty much original. So that's a school where you could use the existing footprint and go out. But the cost for renovations versus rebuilding part of that would be something that would be a decision point for the board. And then Winstead, that school again is another one that you're going to need to take a look at for renovations versus rebuild. The two-story building, renovating that would be cost prohibitive and would not be recommended. But you could look at keeping the newer wing and repurposing that campus. It is landlocked if you think about it, but that one set of the wing that the K students and the younger kids have, as well as the media center and the computer lab back through there and some of the offices are in better shape. But the two-story part of that needs a significant amount of work. So those are just kind of general reviews of the facilities as they sit right now. Again, focusing on elementary because your middle schools are newer, high schools are in a good location, and those would be more renovations. So that was just a conversation piece. So,
Dr. Mills?
Yes, ma'am.
You do not include Daniels within any of the scope of what you have presented thus far?
No, don't have Daniels in there because it's more of a middle high school setup, and Daniels would be one that we would need to take a close look at based on the footprint and this tax is two-story.
Mm-hmm.
So we did put everything in because really just trying to focus on elementary at this point and
Okay.
get the board discussion on that. But we could certainly go back through and talk through the middle and high schools as well. But I think many of their issues, if you look at the numbers and everything else, are more about renovations versus capacities and locations. So that's just it's again starting point.
Okay.
Yeah. So everything we're talking about is just us taking a picture of this and going through the conversations so the board can start having discussion about it. So if you look at what we're approaching to manage 2 million square feet of buildings and 800 something acres of property, we've got about 1.6 for an operating budget, but in reality it's about half that when we consider inspections, waste management, fire protection, supplies, contracts and things before we start working, and then we get $1 million of capital funding from the county. So the issue is well, how are you spending your money on what versus what we get? So we need to take a hard look at age of our buildings and needs and capture that together with what our efforts are. So it's got to balance.
Did you say what or what?
What? WHAT.
Okay,
I thought about it right after I said it. Sorry, Ryan.
it's okay.
Yep.
This mask makes it hard to hear.
So just keeping in mind as we go that part of the issue is if you have the capacity in your buildings and it's not allocated efficiently, then you're spending funds on operating expenses that could be earmarked for something else if you were to make the decisions that I think we're going to need to make to look at school assignment and renovations or building. All those things, again, got to be conjoined because we're spreading it over more buildings now than in reality some of the things we need versus what we would spend if we were to combine those and look at the cost of them over time. None of this is going to happen overnight. I mean, it's going to take some time to lay that out, but that's a discussion point. So just looking at, again, athletics and capital projects, Mr. Letchworth prepared a handout for you that just has athletics on it. It's about 4 pages. There's a couple of things there I think stand out. One is there's about $32 million for athletic projects, and you could look at things such as auxiliary gyms, which we've seen a need for, especially now with the pandemic, field houses and dressing rooms, restrooms, lighting, scoreboards. Those are some of the big ticket items that if you look, and those are consistent across middle and high school. Not the auxiliary gyms, but certainly some of the other pieces. And so those are things you could go ahead and start working on as you're doing the school assignment piece and as you're doing the renovations piece, because they're gonna be separate projects. But I think you could ask for that from the county to see what they want to do, because that was something they said to come back and say what we need. So I think those are pieces and parts for the board to consider. Another aspect would be maintaining our buildings as we're looking at renovations. An assignment, then a painting schedule for all schools would be a good thing. We've heard that a lot. We've talked about this. For a 7-year cycle, which means every school gets painted within the 7-year cycle, that's $1.42 million a year. So we certainly don't have that in our budget, but that would get us back on a path to keeping our schools up to date with paint and some of the comments you heard and you hear in the community. Okay.
Dr. Mills?
Yes, ma'am.
Just one quick question. How often do we paint our schools? I know at one point it used to be like every year during the summer, but I know we're not able to do that. But is there a certain schedule or just as is needed?
And Mr. Letchworth, you want
Yes, so right now we're doing almost 1.5. Sometimes we get the 2 per year. And as needed, naturally, with some of the inspections in our elementary schools with lead areas, we have to address them first. So that's kind of taking priority over a lot of our painting schedule right now.
So have we actually taken care of the lead the most?
Well, we
recent?
have to constantly paint stabilize areas that we can't remove. So, and that's a constant yearly
It's a constant.
paint stabilization.
Because I did see in the report where there were some schools that did still have lead
Yes,
renovations
ma'am.
that were going on.
A lot of these schools prior to that 78 number, that's why we listed that.
Thank you.
Ms. Boyette?
Yes, ma'am.
I know we used to contract, I know when I was at Stantonsburg, we had a family that would come in and park their camper there and during the summer, and they'd paint that school, and then they'd move on to another school and park their camper there, and they'd paint that school. We don't do any I mean, that was a good, cheaper way.
Right. No, we hadn't done any contracting since that individual got out of it, so we hadn't done anything like that.
I remember that too. Right. So this next part's where I'd ask you to take a deep breath and just look through, because these are what-if things, just eyeballing it. And again, these are some of the discussion pieces I think the board's gonna need to have over time. But again, you're going to do the assignment piece and the capital projects piece, next steps, but these are things that I think will come up from ORED or whoever you may choose to do that work. What if scenarios, again, this is what if. Based on location, Winstead could be combined with Vincent Bynum, for instance. You've got a 2-story wing over there that's not gonna be something you would renovate. You could look at the remaining wing, could be the alternative school, print shop, or you could look at the technology center there, and that could absorb Daniels in a way. Again, these are just eyeballing things and talking through them. These would be I think these would be some of the kind of questions you're gonna get faced as you go through the planning process.
If Daniels were closed, would we declare that as surplus? And
I think you could do, I think that would be a piece. There's, that would be a viable option to do that. Again, these are not anything that's sat down, put numbers to paper and exact costs and things, but I think these are the kinds of things you're gonna have to talk about as we go through the planning process. Because if you're looking at trying to maximize and with renovations and any newer buildings, then what we've got to do is decide what square footage is there that's not the ideal for renovations or adding to, and taking that off the plate for managing from a maintenance standpoint, upkeep standpoint. So that's part of the conversation.
Dr. Mills, just
Yes,
for
ma'am.
clarity, so you're saying that the alternative school, if it was closed, it could be housed at Winstead?
On the newer section, there's
The
some
newer
things,
section.
you could add some pieces and parts to that. Again, this is just eyeballing it. You've got a good core down that one K2 hallway. and the media center and computer lab and office area. There's some work you could do there. I think that's a discussion piece. But this is just taking an eyeball look at some of your existing buildings and what could happen. You know, that's really, again, it's just off the top of the head, backing that and kind of scratches, but that could work. It could be some other things too, but the issue is you've got a good portion of that building at Winston that we could use for something else if we weren't gonna maintain that second story section that does not need to be continued.
So saying alternative schools, Daniels is not really a neighborhood, the kids are sent to the alternative school because they need that diverse learning environment for whatever reason, behavior.
But see, Winstead's not a campus where you could expand a lot because where it's located, so you could make a really big building there to do something else with it, and it's so close to Vincent Bynum, I don't even think it's a mile from where it's located, so those are some of the things, just, I think these are things that have come up as you start planning. And Vincent Bynum has the capacity to handle student population, and it could be expanded, and it's in pretty good shape. So those are the pieces for us. These are the kinds of decision points I think you're going to be faced as you start looking at school assignment and the capital piece.
What would be the distance factor if you combine Stantonsburg and Lee Woodard, and time on bus and all of that?
Yeah, I think if you just look at the map,
They're about eight miles apart.
8 miles.
if you look at the map where they're located, let's scroll back up. Again, these are just starting points. This is one where between Stantonsburg and Gardner's and Barnes and Lee Woodard and all those, you could have a conversation about, is there a school location that's more ideal? Or Stantonsburg to Lee Woodard it looks really far on the map, but it's not that long of a shot to go down through there. So those two schools are about the same size as they go to do that from terms of student populations, if you look at them. That makes sense?
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's gonna be a discussion. Stantonsburg's landlocked where that school is sited. Lee Woodard has room to expand. Again, those are gonna be the back and forth you're gonna have to work through.
Okay. So as we go through, or once we have heard these what-if scenarios, as part of the discussion, all of these become the moving parts in that discussion?
Yeah, and I've got what I think the next step should be.
Okay.
Again, Stantonsburg, Lee Woodard, Vic and Barnes could be combined. That would be something that's probably going to come up from the consultants if you go that route. We talked about Barnes has got acreage for expansion. It's built to allow for extension off those wings. Those schools are fairly close distance-wise already. The newer school with Barnes, they could be combined. It would be tight, but in the meantime, you could do some of that. That's going to be a discussion point for the board, I think, when you look at the facilities and capacities and assignments. Wells is another one that could undergo major renovations and extend based on the acreage there. You could look at something, for instance, Hearn could be combined with Wells. Those schools are pretty close together in town. Hearn's not able to expand because of its footprint, but you could use the Hearn building for a pre-K center if you wanted. And extend out. They've done some things there because of the lot. You're not going to be able to build wings off that like you could at Wells. With majority of Wells building need to be renovated. You could go out back and around front with that and then combine those two.
Do either one currently have pre-K classes?
Hearn does.
And so then you could, okay.
Again, I think these are the things you're going to have to talk about. None of these are set in stone, but if you look at possible usages for our facilities and renovation needs and long-term planning, then this is where the assignment piece and the capital piece have to go together. Frederick Douglass, again, we've talked about that. That is a school with lots of space out there, but it's going to take really careful consideration for renovations versus rebuilding based on the setup of it. The last two what-if scenarios I think are going to come up from the work you're going to be doing is Gardner's and Stantonsburg. The locations of those schools are out on the periphery. You could even consider looking at a new school and combining those, bring it in towards town if you wanted to. That's gonna be a question you get asked, I think, from the planners. And then Rock Ridge and New Hope, I think even with Jones there in the mix, it's new and has space. If you look at the growth patterns, just what we've seen, and we're going to get that data from the planning offices as we start working through with the forecasting and assignments, then it may be that you have to consider a new school somewhere between Rock Ridge and New Hope as you go up between the Rock Ridge, New Hope, and Jones area. Depending on what the growth patterns is, and that's going to depend on housing starts and what some of the planners say. I don't think that's out of the question, but I think that may come up. These are all what ifs that are just first gaze at some of the patterns we've seen over time and some of the things I think we're experiencing. And I think these are going to likely be asked by a company like Ord that could do your next steps for you. That's why I wanted to go ahead and put those out there for you to be aware of. So Dr. Fitz, you asked about the next steps or first steps. I think that if we're going to begin to do the capital planning and the assignment planning, then I think the first thing that the board needs to do is decide if ORED is the group that you want to do it. But we need to get on somebody's calendar to begin an assignment plan, if that's the case.
If you go to somebody else, would they want to do their own study and not accept ORED? Or would it be most feasible to go with ORED because they've already done the preliminary work?
Well, I think, I checked with ORED, and if we get them our data file, then they can start work in July, get on their calendar, and you could have feedback and results in September, so we could start planning. You would have enough to work off of through the planning process. Many school systems in North Carolina have used them. I don't know that the forecasting study pieces really affects the planning piece for this aspect of them. And there are other firms, so it depends on what the board wants to do. But I think that they're going to ask you about, they're going to need your data file and priorities. They're going to ask you about what priorities you have, because they will make decisions based on the computer for school assignment. But then the issues we just brought up in terms of what ifs or maybes that I think you're going to have discussion about are consolidation or siting new facilities. Which ones do you want to renovate? Because they can reassign and look at assignment layers in a different way, and that would also affect decisions on construction or renovations. But I think getting on their calendar, that's the board's next step would be a prudent action. And again, I think we're at a point we need some direction to know what to do, but they're going to fill up. Again, we could look at other firms. I'm not saying one firm or another, but the process needs to be, we got to start on an assignment plan so we can have these discussions along with the capital discussions.
So any assignment plan you were looking at, most certainly not this upcoming school year of 21-22, but possibly 22-23, and would any steps be taken other than that in terms of building utilization?
I think if we start the assignment plan work now, And then we can go ahead and have some discussions about the prioritization of capital projects and also the athletic projects. I think there are things that the board could look at and make decisions on that wouldn't be affected by some of the assignment layers. And we could go ahead and put those requests in front of the county commissioners and ask for funding. I think we could go ahead and do that. I don't think we need to go step by step and wait till the end of the process to do it. And I mentioned that at the meeting. I think we need to go ahead and say these are things that won't change whether or not this side of the street goes here, this side of the street goes there. These are still fixed needs that we need to address.
Okay.
And at the same time, again, that pathway can include athletics as a separate piece to go as well. But middle and high schools, those assignment pieces are not going to be as involved to address, I think, as your elementary, because you are going to have more questions about renovations and existing buildings there. So that would be a good place to start.
Okay. So are you ready for questions from the board at this point?
Those are all the slides I was going to pummel you with for the last hour.
Well,
Mr. Mercer?
I don't think what I'm fixing to either ask or suggest is going to make the decisions any easier, but procedurally, somewhere down the line, I don't think it's going to be really good just say, this is what we want to do, and here's a big amount of money we're going to need for the county commission. If it were feasible and manageable, I'd rather see us go to the county commissioners with I don't know what you would call it, but say, okay, if you can afford this much, this is how far we can go, and this is what we can do. And if you can afford this much or manage this much, because it gets a back and forth thing if we come up with one number and go to them and say, well, that's not as much as we expected, or it's more than we expected, but it would kind of shed light on, for us and with them, this is what it's going to cost. Now, just how far can we go, or how quickly can we do it over a number of years, or does that make sense at all? I know it wouldn't necessarily be an easy thing to do, but it would help them have a picture of our thinking, and and their responses would certainly give us an idea of their thinking, and or what they're able to manage or whatever. But I'm just going with one idea and one amount and coming back and so forth sounds like a lot of time spent that we might could avoid if we could do something like that, if that's something we could produce.
Okay.
So you think that the county commissioners need to tell us how much they are going to give us in any span of time to do certain things once the priorities are set, and then we can then say, all right, we can do, given your dollars, we can now do X, Y, Z?
Well, I don't think it's, from their point of view, it's practical to say, here, we've got this lump of money, what can you do with it? Just picking a number out of the air. But if we can provide some sort of document or some sort of, not that it has to be absolutely to the penny, but here's what our thinking is and what we think it'll cost, and we can proceed at various rates according to the funding that's available. Given that, so they would have an idea as to what our intentions are with more money or less money, what the priorities are, and if that makes sense. It just seems to be difficult for them and difficult for us too. We know, we might know what we want, but we don't know what money's available. And it helps them, I would think, it would, if we said, as we get the money, as we get this amount, this is what we can do, and we can go as fast as the coffers will allow, maybe. I was just thinking, and that's a procedural thing more than it is deciding, but I think it might help it move faster if we could provide that kind of information for them, and have an understanding for ourselves as well.
I like that idea, and I also like the idea, I think that it was alluded to in one of the earlier slides, where we have more ongoing dialogue and communication, whether that comes from our chair folks or from the executive directors of, each respective organization.
Other board members have comments, feelings?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
Dr. Mills, in considering, the consolidation of schools and whether we're going to renovate versus build, I think that it would be really helpful to know, what savings we would have in, consolidating 3 schools and building a new school to see if it justifies being able to build that school versus renovating one. As far as like staffing, utilities, maintenance, if we can consolidate 3 schools and save just like $5 million a year, then I think that would offset the cost of building a new school. But, if we consolidated 3 and only save 500, then in that scenario, I would want to say, maybe we need to look at renovating.
Let me throw another monkey wrench in. If you're going to consolidate and you're going to try to find a central location to satisfy moving 3 separate populations together, there comes the issue of land and the availability of land, the cost for acquiring the land. You know that the cost for building a school gets to be a factor as well. So it's more than just what would be the average saving cost. It's also a comparison of what will be the cost and can we find somewhere to put a new school, or would we have enough space on the property of one of the consolidated schools to build something that would accommodate the students. But again, you will have a cost factor in terms of the build, the time for the build, and all of those other factors. So it's not just as easy as if we consolidate 3 schools, if we consolidate 2 schools. There are other issues that we have to consider, but I think the points that you're asking are quite valid points.
Well, yeah, I just want to make sure that, when we're spending, money, that, we're doing it efficiently. That's to me, that's a really important point. I agree with Mr. Breen and Mr. Mercer that, I think that I'd like to see maybe even our board and the county commissioner board maybe meet quarterly and have everybody on the same page. But I would like to see some numbers of, do you know on average how much it costs utility-wise for the,
Depends on the building.
per school?
Yeah, it depends on the building.
Because, with a new school, you would have a whole lot more energy efficiency than you would spread amongst 3. Mm-hmm. Although the land cost would be, offset. So, I think that we need to look at some numbers to be able to make a decision on which route we wanted to go.
I think a good first step to doing that, though, would be getting that ORED assignment study done, so we can see what would be feasible if consolidation is on the table. And then we can we have a better opportunity to generate more feasible or more tangible numbers going forward.
I think that's one of my recommendations. I think you can do both pieces of that, and we talked about that some as we were pulling this information together. That's why I think the 2 are conjoined. Part of the work that a firm like that can do is look at the best sites, if you will, or locations within reason of areas to look at assignments for those in the future, if you will, but that would also talk about distance and costs and things like that. It'll give you a ballpark. We can certainly look at the costs for utilities and costs for, you've got fixed costs for staffing and some transportations and things like that. But I think the bottom line is you've got to go ahead and do the assignment piece to get started on that, to be able to have these other discussions. So the capital piece, like Mr. Mercer was saying, there's no problem with us having those discussions, but if you look at the list of things that we need input from the board on what you want to do.
But when you say assignment, if ORED is doing, to begin assignment planning, is that based on what we currently have, what we're looking to do in future,
They can
whether
do
we're
both.
going, they can do both? Okay.
I've experienced that and talked with them before. They could look at our existing assignment plan
Okay.
and redistribute the capacity and locations that we have. They could also talk about and provide recommendations to the board, and they will come meet with the board and look at and show these are sites that could consolidate where they might be versus you could look at this type of assignment plan. And part of that's going to be the ebb and flow in the conversation the board has with them, and that would go to your next set of questions, which is, so if we do that, then we can go back and look at the impact financially of what that could be or not be. But I think all that goes back to we need to get on someone's schedule to walk the board through that process so that we can be having these discussions and giving feedback to the county commissioners and ourselves on what we need to do and what our priorities are. Because you don't want to do that in isolation. We can do the capital projects. There are some things we can do in isolation. But I don't think where we are with our facility plans and what we're hearing and what we're seeing with enrollment, it's good to do that separate, because I think you're going to end up with a lot more work to do on the back end that you could have saved yourself some trouble.
I don't disagree with Mr. Morgan that being dollar wise and both our board and the county commissioners, but you're getting into some sensitive decisions when you start talking about neighborhood schools, and especially out in the county where it's not just a neighborhood, it's a whole community. Within town, Wells and Winston students at one time went to both schools because of the K3 and the 5, 7 or whatever type of arrangement they had. So the attachments aren't quite as strong, I don't think. But I'm gonna tell you, when you start talking about Lee Woodard, Rock Ridge, Luke Connell, Stantonsburg, Gardners, Elm City, those outer line schools, they have strong communities that have a real opinion about the value of that school being in their community.
Well, anytime we start talking about redistricting, it is a very sensitive discussion within communities, and the sentiments run very high about moving kids, and it's always an experience. I'll put it like that, in order to get this done.
There are some things you can do, and the community and the general public are real concerned about what it costs and how wise the expenditure is. But the dollars aren't as important to some people when it comes to leaving their school and their community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that doesn't make it makes it easier for me, because I probably won't run for re-election. But those that are going to run, and it could make a difference. And so, I mean, while I think we ought to keep the dollars in mind, we ought to keep the hearts of the people at some extent, in touch with them. And I don't think we can leave every school like it is and change too. So, and we know a change is needed. So we're just gonna have to tiptoe through it, do the best we can.
That's correct, Mr. Farmer.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer.
But also like the idea that was offered a couple of times, repurposing the buildings and not necessarily letting them go to surplus.
Yeah, there are the thing I would caution, and Ms. Barnes has got a question, but the one thing I remind the board about the repurposing is if you do that and you're still maintaining those buildings, there's still some costs associated with that. So, you know, those are the things they're gonna point out as you go, in through the process. But Ms. Barnes has been waiting patiently, I think, to ask a question. You didn't have sound?
You don't have sound, Mrs. Barnes.
You can chat it, Ms. Barnes, and I'll read it.
Type it in the chat,
Or just read
please.
your lips, go ahead.
I can hear back now.
She's talking.
Can she hear?
Can you type into the chat?
I'm gonna chatter. So her question was, I'm gonna make sure,
I think she said she was trying.
she wants to ask about the K-8 concept. Is that right, Ms. Barnes?
She says yes.
Okay. Linda's psychic. So, I'm not, here we go. Not if yes, Ms. Barnes. I think K-8 is something the board could consider, but I think that is also, very challenging to implement in terms of school facilities. I don't know. That's not something we went away from K2, 3, 5 when I first came here in 97 and combined and consolidated K5. K8 does still exist out there. And that is a question that's likely to get asked as you look at your capacity in your buildings. I think you're right about that. That is a wide range of issues in one building, so that's not been the pattern. Doesn't mean you couldn't consider it. Mix up her message.
Mrs. Powell, you have any comments, thoughts, and Mrs. Boyette?
Yes, I do. I was sitting here just looking over the history of our schools, historic facts. And there's Wilson County Schools, we have a lot of history. And the thought of, and this is just me thinking, I guess I'm the more sensitive here, but of tearing down a school just kind of makes me feel a certain way when I look at the history, like Vick Elementary. That's the school's named by Samuel Vick Elementary, and looking at Vincent Bynum, named was Sadie Vincent and Ethel Bynum, who were both longtime educators. Wells, it was named in honor of Principal Edwina Lovelace Wells. There's a lot of history here, and I know that we have to look at what's best for our students and serving their needs and in the right communities in the right way. And I know transitioning is another problem. We think about actually moving students from one school to another, having time to transition, because any change affects that community. And just think about small communities like Stanksburg Elementary. You know, that's a community within itself, and those people have been there a long time, and if you've taught at Stanksburg, you would have taught maybe someone's grandparent or great-grandfather, because it's a community school and you have that community that stands behind you. So if you had any issues with the student at Stanksburg, I said, well, I know your grandmother, you know, and I can talk with her. So that community actually comes together and binds together and it stays together. And the thought of that community or any other community not having a school is just kind of it's difficult for me. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, why not renovate? And I know that gets into a lot of costs too, renovating our schools. But just saying, well, we're just going to combine schools and build a whole new school. I remember just an example. I'm feeding off feelings right now. When I went to Coon and I went to Woodard. And I know when they turned Coon into the apartment building and they tore down Woodard, you know, that was history for me because I attended both of those schools. And also Vick. I went to Vick Elementary when it was down at the OIC building. And Darden was over there on Carroll Street. Darden was just 10th grade. And that's when Fight was 11th and 12th grade, before Bedingfield, before Hunt. So as years go on, I guess I'm saying, you know, change does occur, but it makes us feel uncomfortable when we think about the schools and what they mean to us and the names. Darden, Charles H. Darden. I'm getting a little emotional, I'm sorry, but it's just the thought of changing to that degree just kind of upsets me just a little bit when I'm thinking, why not just renovate? Why can't we just work with that And then I'm thinking, well, maybe taking a survey and actually putting a survey out in the community to ask our communities what they think or what the parents think or teachers think, what their concerns are. Are they willing to, would they rather build another school? Would they want to move to another school? Do they want to stay there and renovate and see what we can do to help our communities? Because our communities are suffering. People are moving in certain directions away from certain communities, so the communities are not where they used to be. I've grown up in Wilson. This is pretty much, I've left, but this is mainly my home. And I can see the changes where I live, in the community where I live, with the schools and with the people. My thought is, why not build up our schools? Why not improve our schools? Because even if you transition, you're thinking about the higher quality of education for a child. Just building another school does not mean that's going to improve. It's the quality of that school, within that school. Not saying building a brand new school is going to make everything right. It's going to change everything, or the student's going to progress or show growth. A lot of times it's what's inside the school, the teachers, the principals, what we need to work on inside that particular building to make a transition, to make a difference. And it's just my thinking, and I know that we have to start somewhere, and I appreciate starting with the elementary, because I see that need more so than middle and high school, because we've been working on that all along, but our elementary schools, we really need to look at that and make some changes. And I agree with what Mr. Mercer and Attorney Breen and also whoever had said something, I think you did. Boy, yeah, yes, thank you. But I agree, we do need to, I think, to be on one accord with the county commissioners and how much they are allowing to give us, or the amount that they can actually give us at this particular time. I think we need to know that in order to make decisions like this, because this is difficult to say, oh, we're just going to do this, or we're going to change that, or we're going to move this school, or we're going to tear this one down, or we're going to move the kids over here. It's difficult if we don't have a base plan as to how much money we actually have to spend on that. And then we can kind of piece together, because looking through some of the ideas here, the stats of the buildings, the one where it said, I can't remember exactly, I think it was Frederick Douglass, where Frederick Douglass needs, just bear with me for a quick minute, a change entrance drive for better traffic flow. You know, things like that stand out to me. So better traffic flow for the students getting in and out at the end of the day, or beginning of the day, and the ADA signage. I mean, there's certain things that everyone here is different, so we're going to look at this facility plan, and there are certain things going to stand out more so for certain people than other things. So, but I think that if we look at the amount, maybe, you know, if possible, the amount of money that the county commissioners are willing to allot us, and go from there, and then maybe get the survey out to the community to see how they feel, because this is going to affect the community. It's not just us, but it's the communities that we're talking about, and it's their children, which is all of our children, and the schools. So it just saddens me to think that we have to get to this point to where we're actually looking at changing so much, because this is a drastic change. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. 10-year plan, it's going to take a while. It's going to be a great, huge adjustment for our communities and our families. So, and I'll leave that alone. That's all I have to say.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Boyette?
I think it's important that we look at what our ultimate goal is, and the goal is to get really good facilities for all of our students, while at the same time saving money for the county, which as far talking about closing schools, those of us that are in this room remember when Lambs was closed and Sims was closed and Bullocks was closed and Saratoga was closed. So every community has to go through that, and it's hard. But when you're getting something that looks much nicer, it's a little easier. I like several of the recommendations that you've made in this. For example, Winstead those students could go to Vincent Bynum, and renovating, having the capacity to renovate over at Vincent Bynum. Stantonsburg, I loved that place and spent 2 years there, but like you said, they're landlocked. But if you could really do a lot of changing at Lee Woodard and somehow combine that and give them a much better facility. And you suggested Vic could go to Barnes and just make huge differences in the building there at Barnes. They have the capacity to grow. And Hearn, making that the preschool center. We're always looking, we have so many students that we could be serving in the county if we could get them all enrolled. Moving those over to Wales, and Wales has the capacity to be renovated or just really redone in areas. Frederick Douglass, I agree with you. That might, if we stay there on site and then do something like we did at Rock Ridge or at Lucama, keep the auditorium and gym and then go in there. That I really like that idea. With the Gardeners one, I don't have strong feelings there. I don't know if we're better to rebuild or I would like to see something kept there in that community though, because as you were saying, the communities do matter as much as the money does in some instances. As far as the New Hope and Rock Ridge building a new school, I would much rather see those two schools expanded than try to go find a piece of land and build an entire new facility. I think that you would be better served in both communities to expand each of those schools. And then we still need to have projects that we can go to work on this summer. So there are certainly buildings that we know that we're going to keep open, and we need to go in and get those maintained up to where the standards that we would like to have them at. So some of that money, as far as asking for a certain amount of money, I much prefer coming up with, this is what we would like to, this is our plan. We're going to turn this into a K2 center and move these students to this one. Then this is going to cost however $1 million, how many $1 million, how many, and do it that way so that they can look at it and say, because I don't think the option of saying you have $14 million, do what you can with it. I think that that doesn't work as smoothly as we're saying, here's what we want to do. It costs $4.2 million. Here's what we want to do. It costs $800,000. And then they could say, okay, we can do this now, we can do this later, or things like that. I think that that is a better way of asking for the funding. Those are my feelings.
All right. You've given us the what ifs. What are your recommendations?
My recommendation is we go ahead and get on the schedule and start assignment planning. And or it could, or some firm, depending on who you want to deal with, can assist the board with recommendations for sheer assignment, also consolidation or citing, and they can go through a lot of the questions you brought up today, of the what ifs and some of the other ones, and those are scenarios they could work through and show you the pinch points of them as well as things you might not even consider. And so I think we're going to need that to go forward to talk to the county and talk to our families and our community about next steps in planning, because that's, if we go ahead and get on the calendar to do that, you're talking about getting that results right at the start of the school year. That gives you plenty of time to share and work through things. It is not an overnight process. It is not an easy process, and you're talking about everybody's most precious assets are children, and where those assignments are made. But I think it's time that the board does that because of the capacity that you have and the enrollments that we have, and that needs to be part of the conversation to the county for funding, which is, these are projects we can do, as Ms. Boyd was saying, right now, and go ahead and have those too. I think my recommendation is let's make contact with the company to get on their calendar to start the assignment planning, and then let's have another meeting to look through some of these capital things. We can bring back some projects that we could request funding for in the interim period before we even get to that point. But my goal today was just to get us to the point of, let's move forward with talking about our assignment piece. Because again, they are conjoined.
Mr. Mercer?
Dr. Mills, I agree with you. This is something complicated enough and intertwined enough. I don't think we're gonna do it without stumping our toe or making a mistake or something. But the very worst decision would be to sit and do nothing. And I agree, if we can have that study and gain guidance from it, I'm all in favor of it. And, going into it knowing even with their guidance, things are so intertwined about reorganizing schools and moving people and making decisions, doing the constructions. Someone would be a magician to orchestrate that without any problems. But I'm confident we can get through it. And I'm all in favor of the study and moving forward.
Is that something that would require board action to get started, or is that gonna be a contract under,
It'd be a contract I'd need to bring to the, either, it'd probably under
90?
under the amount, yes, they typically have been. But I think the thing that's gonna be good is, you've got some starting spots for us to have further conversation about some capital projects. But at the same time, there's gonna be an ebb and flow conversations you're gonna have with consultants to walk you through. So what if we were to consider this, and those are scenarios they can bring back and look at. And again, I think you need that information sooner than later.
I think that would allow us to
It would
have
help.
a better understanding of what all the moving pieces are.
Yeah.
Let me share, Mrs. Barnes put
Yeah.
in the chat. First of all, she says, "I can't stand not being able to speak, and this won't happen again."
Quiet Candace, huh?
And secondly, she says she would like to see Gardner's rebuilt. And thirdly, she says, "I would like to meet with the county commissioners, but have our plan in place first." So, Ms. Barnes, you may not vocally be heard, but we're going to hear you through your messages you're sending to me in the chat. So thank you very much. So the chair is willing to, if there are no other questions or discussions to be had at this point, and I think that we would sit here and be just discussing the same thing over and over without any concrete information to be able to make an informed decision. So, Mr. Mercer, I heard your comment, but I think that it is appropriate that we have a motion in order to direct the superintendent and staff as to how you want to proceed. And if I'm not mistaken, you were speaking of moving forward with what the superintendent is recommending to get ORID or some other entity to begin an assignment plan using the what-if scenarios as well as a straightforward scenario with attendance. Am I mishearing you?
No, you're not.
So are you willing to make a motion
I would.
if that is appropriate at this time?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer?
I move we ask the superintendent to pursue with contracting with or contracting with someone to study our reorganization or whatever you want to call it. Is it reorganization and assignment plan?
That'll work.
Okay.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Mercer, seconded by Mr. Breen, that we have the superintendent contract with an entity
That'll work.
for purpose of reassignment and organization. Is there any discussion? I have a question to raise then. Excuse me. If you're having him contract with someone, entity. Are you willing to give that discussion point to him or direct him to order it?
If they are the one he finds in the best position to get us a response quicker, that's who I would prefer, because I think the sooner we can get a response and get the process started, the better.
Okay.
All right.
We can handle that.
Is there any other discussion? Hearing none, please record your vote in regard to this. Mrs. Barnes gives a thumbs up, so she's voting yes. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mr. Boykin?
Aye.
Mr. Breen?
Aye.
Mr. Mercer? Mrs. Powell?
Aye.
And myself, Dr. Fitch, aye. Let the record reflect that the motion does carry unanimously. If there is nothing else to claim our attention,
May I?
yes, Mrs. Boyette.
Do we need to have further discussion about getting us on a 7-year painting plan, or what we need to move forward with? For example, on the plan we looked at before, we had some suggestions for Frederick Douglass, and I would say we would need to hold off on that
Yes.
because we're looking at possibly rebuilding. But do we have enough information that we could go ahead, like, for example, at Vincent Bynum, will we need to expand classrooms? Do we have enough knowledge, or could we move forward with doing some things to renovate some of those places and start with it, right? Mr. Hill made a very good statement, I thought, at the budget meeting when he said, at 4 years from now, we don't know who will be sitting on this board. So we need to do what we can while they are so willing to help us. So that means pushing things that we know that we need forward. So what do we need to do to make that happen is what I'm...
We could bring you some items to the board meeting Monday and work through some of those. We've got some other pieces, but I know we're having a meeting later this week to talk about those projects that we shared with Ms. Steinagel. And again, there might be some changing of those based on the next steps, but I think in the next little bit, we could bring things from the capital plan for the board to approve for us to present to the commissioners.
Including getting our schools on a
Yes.
maintenance plan for painting, so we...
I think that's one that's an easy one that makes perfect sense.
Yes, contracting.
Contracted for that, to go ahead and do that, and as well as some of the projects that we know are not gonna be affected. What we wanted today was input to make sure that was next steps, and based on that, if we can pull everybody together this week, which I think we could bring a list of things to Monday's meeting for you, the board to give blessing to, and I could approach county manager with those. Because I do think now is a good time to take those projects, because again, summer's coming up, there's things we could do when kids are in the building, kids are not in the building, and I would like to go ahead and address some of the areas that are not going to change. I think that was the statement from the budget presentation, which is tell us what you like to do, come with that. So there's pieces not only from the capital side, but also the athletic side too. I think you could do both those, and the painting. I think all those would help. So if the board's okay, again, I didn't want to speak out of turn, but I'd like to see if we could bring some Monday. If not, to go through a list and send them to the board and keep going now. I agree.
I think that addresses your question and concern,
Yes,
Mrs.
that's what I
Boyette.
wanted to do.
All right, so if there's nothing else to claim our attention, the chair will entertain a motion for adjournment.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Mercer.
I move we adjourn.
Second.
It has been moved by Mr. Mercer, seconded by Mrs. Boyette, that we adjourn. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. Mrs. Barnes? Gives a thumbs up. Mrs. Boyette?
Aye.
Mr. Boykin?
Aye.
Mr. Breen? Mr. Mercer? Mrs. Powell? Myself, Dr. Fitch, aye. Let the record reflect that the motion carries unanimously. We are now adjourned.
And it's
Mrs. Barnes, we're so sorry that we had no audio from you, but thank you for putting thoughts in
Good job.
chat and
Good.
sending messages to Mrs. Horrison as well. Thank you.
I hope that she didn't do what I did, because there was one day, I was in another
You did wrong.
meeting, and I didn't have it, but I had my volume turned down low, and I didn't realize it.
Check your
I've done
volume.
that too.
Yeah, I've done
Was it
that,
your volume, Mrs. Barnes?
because her volume may be down.
A
She
good
doesn't-
time to come up with that. but-
That'd be a good time for
I
us to
just
turn
thought
it up.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Dr. Williams raise his hand when they talked about seconding the motion. I was like, all right. He wants to jump in on that.
Hey. Gotta pay attention.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
you
one.
too.
Have a recharge this time. I'm not complaining.
Bought me a long phone cord.
No, it's fine, I'm gonna wind it